Thank you very much for having accepted to record this conversation, and it's an honor and a great pleasure for me to be speaking with you. And in particular, today I would like to talk with you about yourself as a composer, but in particular about composition of yours, the two Grieg piano quintets that I will be premiering here in Seattle next Thursday, June 23rd, as part of the launch of the new ensemble called the Seattle Chamber Orchestra. And just to give a little bit of context to the listener, on the program of this upcoming concert, there will be these two quintets. The first one is the piano quintet in B-flat major that Edward Grieg began writing in 1883 but left unfinished, and yourself, Michael, took charge of completing it. And then there's a second piece, a second piano quintet titled Grieg Quintet Satz, which is an original work of yours that you have probably would have not existed if you didn't first complete the Grieg quintet. And this second work was probably inspired by the need to express your own voice parallel to the one of Grieg. And these two works are, in my opinion, fascinating for the reason that a composer like yourself, who is known for having written works of transcendental difficulty and extraordinary complexity, is able to wear the shoes of a composer like Edward Grieg, with whom there may seem no apparent direct connection, and in doing so, respecting Grieg's style and come up with a final work that could very well be considered as original. So I'm basically curious to know how these two works came about and talk a little bit about the history behind these two compositions.
Well, I've known Grieg's music since I was a child, because there's quite a lot of Grieg's lyric pieces and other works which are accessible to a young pianist who hasn't much experience or expertise. So I've known and been interested in Grieg's music since then. I loved the harmony of Grieg's music, and as I grew older and became more interested in folk music, I regarded Grieg as something of a pioneer in collecting and arranging, because he didn't actually do that much collecting himself. He relied on other people to do the collecting. But the way he arranged folk music seemed to me to be very beautiful. The piece actually, I mean, these quintets started when a colleague of mine, Paul Cox, who was playing cello in a piano quintet, asked me if he'd come across the Peters edition of the incomplete version of this quintet of Grieg's, and he said, would I be interested in completing it? And I said immediately, no, I wouldn't, because I didn't want to fake Grieg's music, because I didn't really feel I had enough expertise to do it. Anyway, a year went past and he asked me again, and again I said no, I wasn't going to do it. And so more time went by, and we were working together all the time on other projects. But then he came again and said, look, I can't find anybody else to do this, and I think it would be really worth doing. So I then started doing much more serious research, and I said to Paul, I will complete it if you give me the chance to make a kind of documentary film of the process of completing it, which is actually a second composition. And what I will do is to more or less replicate at least the first half of the structure, which corresponds to what Grieg left behind. And then there would be a second completion, which, as you say, is entirely in my style. But the first half of the piece would use much the same material as Grieg probably drew on. I don't know for sure. The beginning of the work begins with the same interval. It's a plain open octave, and it's kind of folksy music. And so I went and researched Lindemann's collection of tunes, which Grieg used himself, and then the second section of it, the kind of contrasting material, is slightly Wagnerian in character. And I knew that Grieg had recently, when he was writing this, he had recently been to Bayreuth and seen one of the early productions of Die Walküre. And so I was able to mold the material I'd been working on into something like a Wagnerian section. And then it again returns to folk music and so on. I mean, the piece is clearly in two halves. I mean, both pieces are clearly in two halves with a repeated exposition. And that happens in mine as well, which is probably quite unusual in this day and age to have a repeated exposition. It's something that most people even leave out of Beethoven's symphony performances because they think it's going to make the concert too long. But of course, it changes the way the audience hear the music because you hear it twice in effect. So the first time it's unfamiliar, the second time it's more familiar. So you get this interesting difference with the way most new music is performed and heard. And as far as completing the Grieg quintet was concerned, I just did the research. I knuckled down and applied what I knew about Grieg's method of working to solving the issues. I ordinarily would have probably divided the quintet up into an opening movement and a second movement and a scherzo, or maybe not, and a finale. The problem with that scenario was that Grieg had left a complete exposition of the movement, which lasted in excess of 10 minutes. I mean, it's a heck of a long exposition. So if you were then going to have a development section and a recapitulation, you'd have already covered about 25 to 30 minutes of music without having a slow movement or a finale.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, what else can I do? Grieg would probably never have done this, although he knew he knew about one movement form from Liszt, the Liszt piano sonata. Liszt had actually sight read his way through Grieg's piano concerto, famously this one. So they probably talked about composing too, I guess. And so I decided on a Lisztian structure in which the slow movement, the scherzo in the form of a Norwegian folk dance, and a recapitulation, which functions as a finale, make a one movement arch form, lasting around half an hour. It's quite substantial.
Yeah.
And to all intents and purposes, it sounds like Grieg. I don't think an untutored person would maybe know the difference between it and authentic Grieg. The quintet Satz is another matter. That's at the halfway point, it suddenly goes a bit strange.
What I thought but now you told me that the idea of having two quintets actually came up right away when you were asked to, or when you were repeatedly asked to complete the first quintet. And so you decided from the beginning. I thought that perhaps you would have started completing the first quintet, and then you thought that you needed to express your own voice, and then decided to compose the second quintet. The two quintet came together.
The two quintets really, well, I made it a condition of writing the first one that I was able to write the second. They were both labors of love, incidentally. I wasn't paid to do this work. It was just simply out of interest. And I do always regard the composing I do as a way of learning about composing. It interests me to have a new challenge like this one, because I feel I experienced something I had not experienced before, hopefully learned something about composing generally.
You have done a lot of work. I mean, some of the piano work that you wrote when you were younger had contained, and also the work that you have composed for me has an idea of transcription in it, which you always took to other places, not just a mere relocation of harmonies and material from one composer to another. But how would you place the Grieg work in the context of the transcription?
The only things that are really mine are the choices about the order of the sections and the material that I had to invent, which is minimal. I had to invent the slow movement, which I based on a short piece of Grieg. I mean, it's not a transcription or an arrangement. It's more in the nature of a parody, I suppose, of affectionate parody. And then everything else. In fact, the scherzo section is the same in both works. It's just more highlighted in the second one than in the first. I was gentler with the harmony in some places, maybe. But I didn't have to do very much with it because Grieg's later transcriptions of Norwegian folk music are already very dissonant. And he was very influential on Percy Grainger. So there's a sort of network of connections there. But the whole idea of transcription is difficult to divorce completely from composing, because when you're composing, you're transcribing a thought. And this is not a fast process. You can't sort of shake your hand and then 1,000 notes appear on a piece of paper. You have to write them very slowly, note head first, stem, choose a duration, da, 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 da. And everything you do in what probably amounts to 5 or 6 seconds to make one note changes the way you write the second note, because keeping a focus on everything you do, yes, you can do it, but you can't really do it for more than 4 or 5 minutes at a time. So as you are writing the thought down, the thought is already changing, morphing into something else. So in transcribing another composer's work, I'm nonetheless reviewing what he's done. Unfortunately, the Grieg was a complete torso. This exposition is complete in all details. Now you might think, oh, good, that's half of the work done. But actually it makes life more difficult, because you've got to then deal with a wholesale vision of the material rather than having any freedom to take things away. But it was very interesting to do it, but I do not regard it as an original work. And it is unique in my output in being that way, rather than me interfering with the material and changing it and admitting that I live in 2022 rather than in the late 19th century.
Yes, yes. Is there any documents that talks about this fragment of piano quintet? Any letter by Grieg that might tell us why he didn't complete it, or he left it unfinished?
There is a lengthy essay which precedes the publication of the work in the Grieg Collected Edition, which is published by Peters. And it's also available in, I forget what the name of the company is. It's an American company actually based in Wisconsin, but they also published 3 chamber works of Grieg. There's a piano trio, a second string quartet, and this quintet. The second string quartet was completed quite soon after Grieg died, I think, and the piano trio has also been completed and published as separate works. That in itself is really quite strange. Grieg had sketchbooks like most composers do, you know, it's like a kind of diary that you keep all the time. And Grieg was actually working on a revision of his music for Peer Gynt. A new production of Peer Gynt was going to be put on in the theatre, and they asked him to write or adjust the music that he'd already written. And the sketchbook for that music, for Peer Gynt, and this quintet torso exist in the same sketchbook. And Grieg also drew on material for his second piano concerto, which is also completely incomplete. And I don't know that there's any more more detailed. I don't think there's a facsimile edition of it. There were limits to the amount of research I had time to do. By the time I'd made my mind up that it was going to be inevitable to write it, there wasn't really time to go to Bergen and go through the Grieg manuscript.
I kind of run out of things to ask you. We talked about everything. Is there anything else you would like to say about these two works?
No, I don't really like to talk about music at all. I think it should, those, unfortunately for contemporary composers, I'm in a bit of a minority here in thinking that it should be self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Music is a very ambiguous medium if you try and think of it as being descriptive. It can be evocative, but the sounds of nature don't exist in this kind of music where I have chosen pitches and rhythms which don't exist in nature. So it's not like painting or even writing a poem about something. And this work is quite abstract. It's just called piano quintet or quintet movement, which is giving nothing away, is it? I've mentioned that there are what I think are recognizable snatches of folk music in the piece. And my quintet Satz begins actually in the same style as Grieg and has the same proportions and has exactly the same content, but drawn from different sources. So the Wagnerian exposition in part of the exposition in Grieg is also mirrored by exposition in that style by me, but I'm inventing all the time in a language that is not mine, which is Samuel Beckett observed about writing in French, which he always did in preference to his natural English. It gives you the chance to really look very closely at what you're doing. Nothing can be taken for granted. And I find that quite exciting.
Yeah. I'm interested also in the second half of the second quintet, your quintet. Yes. You leave like 2 full bars of silence as a way of saying, this is where the inspiration kind of ends from Grieg and then I'm taking over. So is the second half completely, you didn't think about Grieg, it's completely yourself. It's your wanting to...
Oh, no. You see, composing a piece of music involves making structures out of small motifs and of working with material. That's a very vexatious term to use, material. What is musical material? People think of composing in terms of tunes, and there are tunes here, but the tune is worked with. It's then treated to something else. It might be extended, it might be turned upside down or backwards, and if you think this is eccentric, then the best known variation in the Rachmaninoff Paganini Rhapsody is actually an inversion of the Paganini theme. And it's something composers do. They work with material. And I wish audiences would listen more to what's actually going on rather than to think, oh, what's this about? It's not about anything. It's about working with musical material, rhythms and pitches. It's a kind of black magic.
Yeah.
That you're doing with sound.
Yeah, you chose to end the second piece in a very quiet way, and almost in I wouldn't know how to describe, some kind of material that kind of dissolves itself into nothingness, as opposed to the way
I wanted it to sound
ends, which is in fact, if I may add one more thing, as a performer, I had a debate. Yeah. And I would like to talk to you about that. If ending a concert in a very quiet way, which I love doing, but as a, you don't yield as much applause from the public if you end in a very quiet way, as opposed to ending with a very strong chord, so B flat major chord. So I just would like to know your thoughts on this.
Well, there are an infinite number of ways in which you can end a piece. And I know audiences love the Rossini crescendo, builds up tension, and then there's a huge loud chord and you go, yay! But that's not the only way.
May I
And
add,
what I was also... Huh?
May I add, especially in America, that's the way endings are liked to be.
Oh, Lorenzo, you're Italian. That's the way Italians like things to be, isn't it? I studied in Italy and went to lots of concerts. And when things ended loudly, the audience would stand up and cheer. And when they ended quietly, it was often the case that people really wouldn't know what to do. Shall we clap now, or is it polite to join in, or what should we do? I don't think in those terms. Am I winding the audience up? Because that's actually really quite manipulative, and I wanted people to engage their minds in this piece about what it is about Grieg's music that can still have such vitality, and is it possible to transform it into something else? And it's not necessarily a yes or no answer. And at the end, I wanted it to feel as if I were looking back through the work I'd done, as you might look back through a photograph album. So you're turning over the leaves, you're thinking, oh, that was nice, or that wasn't so nice, or that might have been interesting if I'd done. Oh well, no, I'll leave that. So it's slightly indecisive, and you're not sure how it finishes. I mean, it's not all quiet. Actually, the last phrases are quiet, but the one before that, there's a set of similar kind of figure where it goes blah, 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 silence, blah, 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 silence. And the first time that happens, it's quite quiet. Then it's very loud, and then it's a diminuendo, and then it's quiet at the end. Because having set up fortissimo and then gone to mezzo forte, the next step is either going to go back to fortissimo again, or it's going to be pianissimo. It's a choice.
It's a choice. It's definitely very effective for a performer, because I also realized that the other piece you wrote for me, the Geistervariationen, end in a very quiet way, and when I play them, exactly the audience didn't know what to do. Is the piece finished? And there's this moment of absolute magic, which I think it's absolute magic, that there's this space of non-defined, and I think it's great that in a concert that can happen. And I think it's going to happen too with this quintet, where there is silence, and hopefully people are going to listen very quietly and very closely to what's happening.
I think it's also resonance time, so that you allow the audience space to think just quickly about what's happened in the piece. Whereas the wind-up and big bang idea, it may be effective like somebody scoring a goal in a football match or whatever, but it kind of erases the rest of the piece momentarily. So you might only then remember the piece and start thinking about the piece again as you're going home, or maybe the next day. And I wanted not to break too much of the continuum of thought that had gone into the piece, because it is quite a thoughtful thing. So it would have interrupted that, I think, to have gone boing at the end.
Do you think the two pieces always need to be performed together, or you would see a live for both separate?
They have been done separately, and I think that's perfectly okay. I didn't design them to go together in that sense, so that they were mutually dependent on one another. obviously, if you program both in a concert, as you're doing, you enable the audience to hear the similarities and the differences much more clearly.
Yeah.
But I think they're self-sufficient. I think they would stand. And I know of at least one concert where the Grieg transcription or completion has been played on its own in a concert of other 19th century music and been accepted as a 19th century piece of music. I'm acting as a sort of editor, so it's an editorial role rather than a compositional one.
Yeah. Have you thought about more completions of Grieg's music, for example, the second piano concerto? Would that be something you would be interested in working on?
I actually do quote the sketch of the second piano concerto in a context of one episode in the history of photography and sound, which is about Munch, Edvard Munch. And so it seemed natural to use another Norwegian composer that I'd been involved with. But no, I wouldn't want to complete any. I don't think I don't think I enjoyed the experiment of Grieg. It was an interesting challenge to do once, maybe, but no, not again.
Is this something that if I keep asking, then in 2 years you'll say yes, or like
you're trying to wear me down? If I say definitively no, of course, that doesn't mean anything, does it? But I would prefer not, Lorenzo.
I won't take no as an answer. Let's say that.
No, so few people do. I noticed in the recent email, if you don't mind me mentioning this, you asked about metronome marks, which is possibly quite interesting for the audience too. How definite is a metronome mark? Do I expect it to be adhered to? I don't, yes. Because if you play any self-respecting recording, whatever the metronome speed at the beginning is not going to be adhered to for much more than about 2 or 3 bars by any good performer. And the metronome marks are just suggestions of the kind of area of tempi that you might want to explore. And even then, I design these pieces so that there are holes through which the performer can get to the music. I don't close off the possibility that the performer has their own vision of how they think this piece should go. I would hate to think that somebody would be scared of playing it faster or slower than the metronome mark. That's not the point. The point is that you know the music well enough that you can inhabit it and become it. A performance is always a recreation or a creation which is independent of all previous creations. So you can make the decisions based on a complex of other ideas that each individual brings, I mean, from their musical experience. In the case of an orchestral concert, the conductor is making his mind up. And so actually the musicians don't have any choice. They follow the conductor. That might make life more pleasant or less pleasant, depending on how you get on with the conductor, I guess. For soloists, it's not an issue because they make decisions again, which they then act on according to their own feelings. I'm so thrilled that you're doing it, and
thank you.
You know, I just love the idea of you doing it. I'm sorry I can't be there to share the experience with you, obviously, but it's a long way from North Norfolk to Seattle, and
of course,
it's difficult at the moment still to travel.
Well, I want to thank you for this lovely conversation and for having given the time to express your opinions and your thoughts about the 2 pieces. I'm sure the audience will be enhanced in their listening by the words, by the things that you said. And so,
as always, Lorenzo, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.